Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Alain Enthoven, who is the Marriner S. Eccles Emeritus Professor of Public and Private Management at Stanford University. He's written numerous publications, and I will mention two. He is author with K. Wayne Smith of How Much is Enough? Shaping the Defense Program, 1961 to 1969. And recently he edited with Laura A. Tolan Toward a 21st Century Health System. Professor Enthoven, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Seattle and raised there. A beautiful place for a boy to grow up.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Oh, a great deal, a great deal. They're both immigrants, but not wetbacks. Their courtship was at Oxford University, and then they moved to Seattle. My father came first, got a job, then brought my mother over.
And they were from?
My mother was French and my father was English. Mm-hmm. And her father was a professor at the Sorbonne, and his father was a partner in Lloyd's of London, in one of the parts of Lloyd's. And so they came to Seattle, and I think that one thing is that even though practically my whole life I didn't leave the Seattle area except to go to Victoria, Canada, say, that this background gave me kind of a large worldview. You know, I knew what was going on in England and France and in Europe.
Was there a lot of talk about world politics, world events at the dinner table?
Quite a bit, yes.
And so was it inevitable that you went into the grappling with these big public policy questions, or was that bug get you later when you were an undergraduate?
Well, it's kind of a set of curious chances, but I came to Stanford as an undergraduate, majored in economics, and I was excited by the potential of economics to better understand and mitigate some of the world's great problems. Then I went to Oxford, and there I met Harry Rowan, who had come from the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, and we were in the same Master of Philosophy and Economics postgraduate program. And we became good friends, and then he started telling me what he'd been working on, and I thought, wow, this is really important stuff. I mean, this, you know, the world is hanging on the balance of our getting this right. So Harry arranged that I would come to the Rand Corporation for a summer between my 2 years at MIT, where I was working on a PhD, got my PhD. And so I spent a summer. My boss was Charlie Hitch, who subsequently became president of the University of California. And we were working on major issues of nuclear strategy and related questions, and also with pioneering and kind of methods of analysis and thought about those. So that's really what got me into national defense.
And it must have been a really exciting time intellectually in terms of the ferment, and I guess what you were shaping was what we came to understand as system analysis. Is that?
Yes.
Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the. We developed the term systems analysis because although it was broadly under the aegis of the economics division and Charlie Hitch, we needed a disciplinary neutral term, because one of the great things that Rand did was genuine interdisciplinary problem-solving research. And so we economists, of course, knew that what we were doing was applied economics, but we needed the help and cooperation of political scientists and engineers, physicists, and so forth. And so we couldn't say they were doing economics, although some of them were very good intuitive economists. But so we were studying weapon systems, so then the term emerged, weapon systems analysis.
And this would have been what period? The late 50s or?
Well, this took place through all of the 50s. I first came to Rand in the summer of 55 and then came back as a full-time employee in the summer of 56. So I was there full-time for the late 60s, late 50s.
And so it was McNamara who, when he was appointed Secretary of Defense by President Kennedy, brought this team to Washington. Talk about that and how the package that you put together in the Pentagon.
Well, yes, I had no particular connection with the Kennedy people or McNamara, although I was sure hoping that Kennedy would win. In fact, I think we were off touring in Israel when the election happened. But so I came back, and I was working in the Pentagon. That is Charlie Hitch's suggestion. I took a year's leave from Rand to work in the office of the Secretary of Defense to kind of get a better picture of what it was all about. In fact, I'd said to Charlie, the decision-making process is just all messed up. I'd like to write a book about it. And eventually I did. Mm-hmm. But Charlie said, a good idea for you to go to the Pentagon for a year or so and experience it and,
And this would have been what year?
Well, this was the late 50s.
I see, before Kennedy, yeah.
Yeah, before Kennedy. So in 1959, we moved to Washington, D.C., and I went to work in the Pentagon. Then the next thing I heard was Kennedy elected, picked McNamara, and I remember we hadn't had such a good impression about Engine Charlie Wilson. That is, our Rand group didn't think that he was...
The previous Secretary of Defense.
Previous Secretary of Defense, yeah. And so a little bit the reaction was, I don't think we need another automobile company executive. Of course, we didn't know what we were talking about. So McNamara picked Charlie Hitch. The Kennedy people, President Kennedy had split off a team from his campaign to do what they called the talent hunt. And they compiled dossiers on leading candidates, regardless of party affiliation, regardless of whether they supported Kennedy, just leading candidates for each of the cabinet jobs and the sub-cabinet jobs. So McNamara was nominated, and then he interviewed people on his list, met Charlie Hitch, and I'm told and can understand that it was love at first sight. Charlie had just written a book called The Economics of Defense in the Nuclear Age, and it laid out a lot of, what McNamara is looking for, serious, disciplined, quantitative analysis of issues. So Charlie became the Assistant Secretary of Defense Controller, and right away Charlie called me and said he'd like me to come over and be one of his deputy controllers. Pretty exciting times for a 30-year-old boy.
Mm-hmm. And your mandate was to put together a systems analysis team. How did you go about doing that? Because I remember at a time when I was in high school, there was much talk about the whiz kids, and yeah. That was you and your team.
Well, let's see. I remember Charlie Hitch explaining to me the vision, which he said, what I want to do to introduce into this is programming and systems analysis. Programming was a new method of planning, of financial planning, which would group the dollars by weapon systems and strategic commitments, like strategic retaliatory forces and where is all the money going, so that the Secretary of Defense could control that. So my first assignment was to work with people that he brought in who were more budget process and system kind of people to get that up and going. So when that was up and going after a few months, then to break off and to create the systems analysis office. And what we were to do was, you might say, serious, disciplined, quantitative analysis of issues, of requirements and strategy. How much is enough and what should the strategy be?
And you put together a team. How did you go about doing that? I mean, I gather
Well,
you were recruiting the best talent from all over the country.
Yeah, well, you know, I had going for me that Kennedy and McNamara had generated a lot of excitement and glamour, and Charlie Hitch was a major player too. The Rand Corporation, which had previously been fairly secret, and it was now getting a lot more visibility. So I had the wind at my back in doing this. I remember just bright guys showed up somehow, like Joe Peck, who was a professor at the Harvard Business School, and then David Stager, who was a Rhodes Scholar at New College, Oxford, with me, and was at the Federal Reserve and was an economist. And I persuaded him to come over. And Vic Heyman was a very bright young political scientist, and he knew somebody who knew somebody who knew me. And so I interviewed him and thought, yeah, this is good. And so after a while, I got a little more systematic about it. One great source was that quite a few, I say young men because at the time this was kind of a man's operation. Now there are women in this business doing a great job, which I welcome, I'm all for it. But anyway, if I say young men, it's because that's what it was at the time. And so there were quite a few young men getting their PhDs in the disciplines I wanted and needed, in economics, for example, or in, you know, mathematical sciences and quantitative disciplines. And so I started getting help from the personnel offices of the military services in bringing in ROTC lieutenants and having them do their tour of duty working for me, and got some just outstanding talent that way. One was Larry Lynn, who became the head of the kind of mobility and transportation studies. Another was Les Aspin, who also had been at Oxford and then PhD at MIT in economics. And Les came to work for me, and also just very bright, creative. And a remarkable thing about him is that when he finished with us, he went back to Wisconsin and ran for Congress, was elected to the Congress. And I still remember the joyful day when he first said he wanted to be on the Armed Services Committee. And I had been given a very bad time by Mendel Rivers, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee from Charleston, South Carolina. And one day, Mendel Rivers, I guess, somehow gotten on the wrong side of many members of the committee. And Les Aspin unhorsed him and became the chairman. It's probably a little vindictive of me, but I was so happy when I heard that news. And then Les went on later to become Secretary of Defense.
Help our audience in the general public understand systems analysis. Your book, which I recommend, and just recently read, How Much Is Enough, which has been reissued, helps us understand that what was new to what you were doing, besides bringing economic analysis, was trying to look at the larger picture.
Yes.
And to look at weapons acquisition, for example, in the context of other presidential goals, and to tie that to the actual budgets, how much do we want to spend, what do we really need, and break. So in addition to seeing the whole, you wanted to understand the complexity of the parts.
That's right. Thank you. Good description. I would say on the understanding the whole, the big picture, sometimes when questions would come up, McNamara would say, Alan, first start with the grand totals, okay, the big picture, and then work your way down. And so in our office, we jokingly called that McNamara's first law of analysis, was start with the grand totals, or the big picture. So also a tradition that we brought from the Rand Corporation. I might say, by the way, that also some excellent people came to work for me from Rand that I'd known and worked with at Rand, several of them, and they became important leaders in the scene. And the kind of the founding legend, if it wasn't a legend, I mean, it was true, but back in the early 50s, the Air Force came to Rand and said, we would like you to study the question of where should our air bases be located? Because, of course, there are 535 people on Capitol Hill who know just where they should be in their district. And so we need to have some analytical, systematic basis for where the air bases should be and why. And so Albert Wolfstetter, who is just truly brilliant leader in this line of thought, you could say he was the founding thinker, if you like, recruited, among others, Harry Rowan, who I'd met at Oxford, and Fred Hoffman, who was also in the economics division. And they did a study called the Selection and Use of Strategic Air Bases. And the first thing is they looked at the question and said, this isn't quite the right question. We have to first ask, what are we doing here? Why do we have this Air Force anyway? What are its purposes? What are the broad purposes that we can explain and defend to the President and to the American people as to what this is serving? So in the process, they kind of completely overturned the previous conception of what strategic air warfare was about. Previous conception being it's just World War II with nuclear weapons. We're going to fly repeated sorties, dropping a nuke here, a nuke there, and so forth. And Wolfstetter, Rowan, and Hoffman thought this through and said, well, wait a minute. One thing is if you embark on that kind of a war, when your bombers get home, there may not be any bases there because the Russians might have just wiped out the bases. And especially we had a lot of overseas bases which would be quite vulnerable to Soviet bomber and or missile attack. So they kind of boiled it down finally to the key insight that the purpose of these forces must be to survive a Soviet first strike that was intended to destroy them, and then be able to strike back and inflict unacceptable damage on them, such damage that the prospect would deter them from attacking us.
Sorry, go ahead.
So it's think more deeply about the question. Is that really the question? Keep deeper and deeper to.
And so what in the process of your analysis, you're really raising questions about assumptions, about how this fits together with something else, which then leads you to say, as you just said, well, what are the goals here? Do we really want to be doing this? Now, in doing that kind of rigorous analysis, you really ignited a firestorm of protest from the military, as I understand it, who were used to getting whatever they wanted because it was for national defense.
Well, I think the firestorm of protest sometimes got magnified a little bit by the media and the press and by some politicians who thought that would be useful for their purposes to attack Kennedy and Johnson and so forth. I had great personal relationships with a lot of the military leaders. And so I think firestorm is too strong a phrase. It's true that we did overturn some of the basic modes of thought. That is, for example, in the Eisenhower years, the budgeting was done on a kind of incremental basis that, Army, Navy, and Air Force, we can afford about 3% more next year, so you prepare a budget that's last year plus 3%, and then we'll kind of work from there. And because we were introducing these very fundamental questionings of the whole thing, we didn't take that for granted. In fact, at first, we're saying there are no predetermined limits on the budget. This is national defense, it's crucial, survival's on the line, so we're going to really figure it out. And without any presupposition, we might end up with a bigger army or a smaller army. And in fact, one of the big things was our strategic, what Kennedy named strategic retaliatory forces, because that's really what they're meant for, were dangerously vulnerable on the ground. And this is what Wohlstetter and Rowan and Hoffman showed in their report, that all of our strategic retaliatory forces could be wiped out by a relatively manageable number of Soviet missiles. So that was extremely dangerous, especially when coupled with our NATO strategy, which was threatening to start a nuclear war if they attack us.
You write in, I think in How Much Is Enough, no large organization is likely to pursue automatically the broader national interest as distinct from its own parochial or institutional interests without external forces and leadership. So over time, you're saying you were able to legitimate what you were doing because you were opening up a new way to think about the national interest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Looking back, what did you learn from this experience bringing rationality to public policy in a domain which pushes so many buttons? I mean, national defense is national defense, and if we're not doing it, my goodness, what will happen?
Well, I'm smiling at your question because I've often been asked, and I say, well, what I learned was that the ideal weapon system is built in 435 congressional districts. And so it was very interesting because, of course, by the Constitution, we have 3 branches of government that are separate and equal. And the Congress are elected by their constituents, presumably to serve their constituency, to do what is best for their constituents. And there's a certain conflict there because bringing home the contracts and the bases. So sometimes I felt, well, they don't care too much about whether the weapon system works or not as long as it's built in their district. And I'm not putting them down, I'm just saying it's natural. Mm-hmm. They were hired by their voters to do that. So I learned then about kind of the conflict between, I felt we got our legitimacy from the fact that, 1, the president was elected. 2, Kennedy had campaigned quite explicitly on military strategy. I thought it took a lot of courage for this unusually young man running for that job going up against the great general, because he was criticizing Eisenhower's strategy, saying vulnerable strategic retaliatory forces on the one hand. On the other hand, over-reliance on the first use of nuclear weapons in Europe. That was called tripwire and massive retaliation. Soviets cross the line, bam, General LeMay bombs them back to the Stone Age. So we felt, now we understand clearly, and it's the job of the president, secretary, et cetera, to explain to the American people, this is what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. That is, of course, going to generate a lot of controversy in and out of the Pentagon, in and out of the Congress.
Was that a unique leadership, the combination of Kennedy and McNamara in terms of foresight and a willingness to fight these issues out?
Well, I think it was an unusual combination, but you had 2 men who were unusually committed to thinking the thing through and taking a stand and fighting for it, rather than the usual thing, which is just, I remember what Adlai Stevenson said about Richard Nixon once, that man who sails downwind whichever way the wind is blowing. So, yeah, I think, and McNamara, an exceptionally powerful mind, of course, a Berkeley graduate.
Mm-hmm. Which made all the difference.
Made all the difference, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And he just loved to really dig into things. In fact, I remember one of the other deputy controllers sometimes would call McNamara the senior analyst, because we'd do some analysis and bring it to him, and it wasn't a case of just presenting it for rubber stamping. He'd dig in and tear it apart, and very stimulating for me. When you say, what did I learn? Well, I learned that it was possible to think more deeply, more critically, to think through a problem.
And I guess it was important for you and your team to have the support of these two leaders.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah.
Absolutely.
Because you weren't always treated well by Congress, I get the impression from the book.
That's right, yeah. Especially the Armed Services Committee had a lot of people from the South who were, I think, often uncritically pro-military. Now, I was pro-military too, but I felt we have to get them pointed in the right direction.
You left the defense field in the late 60s or early 70s and moved in to healthcare reform. How did that, and why did that transition come about? Because clearly you've taken the two big problems of public policy. Was that intentional?
Well, let's see. A couple of things happened about the same time. I left in early 1969. I decided I'd been in national defense for 12 or more years and I'd like to do something new. And besides, Nixon had made a campaign promise to root out the whiz-kid approach from the Pentagon, so I didn't feel I was going to be welcome with them. So I decided during Nixon's inauguration, I'm going to drown my sorrows with my family in powder snow at Sun Valley. And then from there, transition. Well, so in the late 60s, I had become acquainted with the man who was president of Georgetown University. And at the time, the board of directors were all fairly elderly Jesuit priests. And they had made a decision, it's time for us to bring in some kind of modern younger men. And who might we get? Well, I'd graduated from a Jesuit high school and kind of remained friends with some of the Jesuits. And so I guess they thought of me as a reasonable candidate for that. And in fact, what they had in mind was that some of the thinking that I'd brought to the Pentagon was probably also applicable to education. And they were forming, they didn't call it Systems Analysis Office, but it was like a Systems Analysis Office for Georgetown University. And interestingly enough, later on, Charlie Hitch tried to do the same thing here at the University of California. Therein lies another story. So there I was at Georgetown University. And the most critical financial issues were the medical center. I'd started in the finance committee and said, I'd better get over there and dig into those. So I really dug into the University Medical Center.
You were a policy advisor or at Georgetown?
Oh, I was on the board of directors.
Oh, on the board of directors.
Yeah,
okay.
I was on the board of directors
okay.
of the university.
Yeah.
And I was on the medical center committee of the board.
Correct. Yeah.
And really studied all this stuff. One of the most memorable developments was that the Department of Community Medicine was studying what is the future of medicine? Where is this going? What's it going to be? So that we could reflect that in how we teach our students. And they had concluded that the future ought to be prepaid group practice. And I studied all that and joined them. And in fact, it resonated with me because I grew up in Seattle. I had a newspaper route up on Capitol Hill where Group Health Cooperative of Puget Sound built their first hospital. And I followed that, kind of with some interest. Oh, this is like Group Health Cooperative. Great, and so I learned more about it. And I reached the same conclusion. This is the only tenable, as one conservative friend of mine said later on about Kaiser Permanente, this is the only tenable bastion of private enterprise in American medicine. That is something that can be self-disciplining and self-regulating. And so I was impressed by that. Then I decided I wanted to go into business. Nothing to do with defense, just into private commercial business. And I went to Litton Industries, based in Beverly Hills. And after a time, I became president of Litton Medical Products, partly based on the fact that all my studies of the medical business at Georgetown gave me some background. So there I was, head of a multinational medical technology company. And I got more and more interested, again, because I could see where the market was leading us was not good. it was to more and more complexity, the latest, fanciest thing. Didn't matter, cost effectiveness be damned. Just, give us the latest thing without any serious evaluation of the benefits versus the costs, something that's still a major problem in medicine. So then I was elected to the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, which is kind of a high-level body of people meant to come together to advise the government on healthcare policy. And I got very interested in that too. I thought, wow, this is, I went to some of their meetings. I enjoyed these discussions. So then when R.J. Miller, who was the dean of the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, was trying to create what he called a public management program, like a little bit like a Kennedy school within the business school, and he recruited me to Stanford, and I decided that's what I think I want to work on. The great thing about being a tenured full professor is you can follow your stars, for better or for worse. And so I was a little ahead of my time, but this was 1973. I just decided the way healthcare was organized and paid for, we were just really asking for trouble. This was going to grow and grow and grow and eventually strangle us financially.
As I mentioned to you, I was reading your book on the plane and at the same time reading some of your articles that you sent me about medical care reform. And I was struck by the similarities. Obviously, there are differences between these two public domains. So I'm curious, as you grappled with this problem, and you sent me two articles which you wrote in the 70s, which really laid out the landscape. I mean, they're absolutely quite a read in terms of being both logical and sort of grappling with this medical reform system. So my question is, did your work in the Pentagon and the political experiences you have there informed you, or was it really the system analysis and the opportunities that you were presented with that gave you kind of a feel for this?
Well, I think the systems analysis experience helped a lot. For one thing, a point of entry was we really need to have serious ways of subjecting medical technologies to such evaluation and analysis so that we don't spend the whole national income on stuff that's not really productive. And also, my background as an economist, that economic incentives matter. And I looked at fee-for-service medicine and said, this is what now people are coming to understand more generally. This is paying for volume, not for results. And the thing I liked about prepaid group practice was the doctors don't get more money for doing more things. The enterprise prospers if they can keep you healthy and well. And if you have a medical problem, solve it in the most effective and efficient way. So, it was the same person thinking in there. One case, also I think with national defense, I remember doctors would come into our board meetings in their white coats and so forth, and pound the table and say, we absolutely have to have such and such. And I did have the reaction, yeah, I've met people like you before. I called them Admiral. And like they wanted us to build a new hospital not far away from the existing one because everybody wanted to be together in the same building. And I remember one of my fellow board members saying, for a tiny fraction of the cost, we could hire a limo service that every 5 minutes would drive people from one hospital to the other hospital. But it just impressed me in both cases that people were not looking for alternatives that gave value for money. So intellectually there was a good deal of similarity, even though there's a great deal of difference. But also issues of life and death and values and what is this all about anyway?
And what the conclusion you come to, even in the early articles, was really that the system, because you had perverse incentives, was essentially calling what it did free enterprise, consumer choice, but that wasn't the reality, and that in fact it was not producing the best product for the most people.
That's right. It wasn't producing the best product. It was producing, in both cases, there was a problem that it was producing what seemed best for the producers. Mm-hmm. I mean, we get back to the problem of the traditional military method of budgeting and so forth, and there, a career interest was a lot at stake. I don't want to impugn the military again, because I had many such good friends that I admired so much, but on your fitness report, it certainly was reflected whether you behaved in such a way as to advance the interests of your military branch. And if you were a submariner, then you'd want to see more submarines so you'd have a greater opportunity to be a captain of a submarine and so forth. And with medical care, sort of a similar process. If you do more and do more expensive stuff, you'll be more rewarded, not only with money, but with prestige and other resources and so forth.
And it seems that it's the vested, here you are trying to bring rationality to an important domain of our public budgets. And what you're encountering is vested interests.
Yeah.
And vested interests that have evolved over time. Mm-hmm. So in the case of healthcare reform, you confront the fact that, especially after World War II, part of the contract negotiations with labor created incentives to produce health insurance that created systems that wanted to spend more and more money and had no clue about cost and the greater good.
Right, that's right, yeah. That's why I felt what I'd learned in my experience at Georgetown was so valuable, because prepaid group practice is a distinct alternative to that. That is, this is a case of teams of doctors who accept responsibility for managing the quality and the cost and for giving their enrolled members some value for money, which was very different from the rest of medicine. So prepaid group practices were unfairly attacked, criticized, reviled, et cetera, on and on, which led me, when I came to Stanford, to find my way over to Oakland, to the headquarters of Kaiser Permanente, and talked with the CEO and the executive vice president, talking about what I'd been doing, and saying, I believe in your cause, can I help? And I remember Jim Vose, also a Berkeley graduate, who became the CEO and a very good friend of mine, saying, well, Alan, we've come all this way without a consultant, but what the hell, let's give it a try. Let's give it a try. And here, 37 years later, I'm still a consultant of Kaiser Permanente and value that connection.
And what, so in this book, Toward a 21st Century Health System, the collection of essays you've gathered here with your co-editor really focus on the virtues of the prepaid system as opposed to the fee-for-service system, and help us understand what it is. What is the result? If we're doing a system analysis, if you have fee-for-service payment, what are the consequences for the whole system?
Well, I think the main consequences are that the system keeps expanding uncritically. That is, some new technology will come along. For example, coronary artery bypass graft surgery for someone who has clogged coronary arteries and therefore some chest pain. Well, some creative and progressive heart surgeons developed, that's probably Dr. Shumway at Stanford and others, developed that operation in which they would take a vein or an artery from elsewhere in your body and make a bypass around the clogged artery. And that became a billion, and this is at a time when $1 billion was a lot of money, $1 billion a year industry before the publication of the first randomized controlled trial. So essentially, before there was any evidence as to whether it really did any good for the patients or not. And there were prominent physicians, sort of medical men rather than surgical men, who questioned whether that was valuable. And in fact, the experiment showed that it only prolonged lives for a small subset of all the people who were getting the operation. So it was just lacking in evaluation. And because the whole mentality with, I usually call that open-ended fee-for-service, because there's no prospective budget. You know, the patient is suffering, the doctor's been trained to help the patient, the doctor wants to do what helps the patient, and not to think about the cost. And you don't particularly want the doctor to be thinking about the cost at the bedside, but you'd like somebody upstream to be thinking about overall which technologies give greater value or not, and so forth. So along comes prepaid group practice, and well, they have several important basic ideas, one of which is teamwork, but one of which is the group as a whole are responsible for the results. And let us say Kaiser Permanente has made a deal with Stanford University that they will take care of our employees for $400 per person per month. Doesn't sound cheap, but it is our lowest cost plan. And so then the doctors, okay, we now have a duty to figure out what's the best way to use this money on behalf of our patients. We can't act like money is no object in this kind of a framework.
So in a way, the organization creates an environment in which you get systemic thinking
Yes.
and analysis,
Right.
just as a byproduct of the way things
Yes.
are organized. Now, when you first started writing, I get the impression you thought that it was going to be easier to convince employers and others and physicians to make these changes, but you found out that wasn't the case.
Well, it certainly wasn't the case. It was a lot harder than I think probably I'd been spoiled by the Kennedy and Johnson and McNamara experience, that you've got some smart people in charge, they study issues, listen to reason, and will act on evidence. Now we get to healthcare and nobody was in charge, which is all right, but I came to believe the consumer ought to be in charge. The informed, cost-conscious consumer ought to be in charge.
And importantly, you don't think government regulation is the answer, because you make a very interesting argument that government regulation tends to favor the producers and create monopolies that don't take account of the consumer.
Right. Government is inherently responsive to those with the resources to influence government. There's nobody on Capitol Hill really speaking of, there are a few, but generally speaking, they're not driving for what's best for consumers. They're driving for what they think is best, which they wrap up in the mantle of consumers. But I think that's not the same thing as doing what, let's say, you have at the University of California, where as an employee you are presented a menu with a range of choices, and
that is in terms of health insurance plans.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah, in terms of the health insurance plans you have, it's similar to what we have at Stanford. So the employer says, we give you this range of choices. As far as we can tell, these are all good quality, reputable, high quality people. So we're not offering you El Cheapo or something we wouldn't want our family to be in. And here are these choices. If you want something that costs more, it must be because you see value there, and so you pay the extra cost. And so both at the University of California and at Stanford, 80% of the employees choose prepaid plans, not open-ended fee-for-service. That's pretty remarkable.
And interestingly enough, you see a major change that would be for the good if on the one hand there is at least two choices of plans, and the employee is given a fixed amount that they will be reimbursed for the plan they choose. But what the irony is, this has been hard to implement beyond places like Stanford and Berkeley. And I think you say that only 10% of employers give their employees these choices, which would have really revolutionary implications in terms of the cost of the system.
Right. Well, that's right. And it's fairly disappointing because it has revolutionary implications for the organization of the system, because what I described about University of California and Stanford is also true in other settings where the employer offers employees choices, but cost-conscious, responsible choices. In Wisconsin, with the state employees, they have a similar model, and over 90% have chosen prepaid plans. So I see that informed, cost-conscious consumer choice is the thing that ought to drive, the force that ought to drive the system in the direction of giving people what they want and giving them the most value for money.
And you say that the you weren't able, or this way of thinking wasn't able to convince employers to make this change. And at one point you say in your new book that you didn't recognize that the way the short-term interests in the face of these problems would work against long-term solutions or choosing them.
Yeah. Well, I think each employer, understandably, so like I was saying about Congress before and how they're set up and what their job is, each employer's job is to look out for the best interests of the shareholders. And by the way, because of the way stock markets work, fairly short-term interest of the shareholders. So you'd be reluctant to do something that might depress quarterly earnings this year in exchange for something better in the long run. You might, but you'd have to convince investors that that was a good idea. So then employers looking at it, should we offer a number of choices? Well, one thing is if they're small, it's just too expensive. I mean, at Stanford, where we're dealing with, and University of California, where you're dealing with a bunch of different health plans, well, you have to manage those contracts, you have to make the contract. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't need to be very expensive, but for a small employer, that would look very costly. Then, I think another problem is that historically, the organized medical profession was always putting down the idea of prepaid plans, and I think wrongly implying that they're somehow second-rate or not as good. There's still a hangover of that in our culture. So a lot of employers, they want to use their employee benefits to attract employees. So they want to give what they think the employee will find most attractive. And even large employers, where it wouldn't cost so much, just have not thought that offering choices, including prepaid plans, is something they really must do. I think one of the problems, by the way, that's very important in the whole thing is public policy. That is, the tax laws as they exist today exclude from employee taxation the employer contribution to health insurance. So that biases choices in favor of more costly and is a powerful economic force pressing in the direction of just open-ended fee-for-service. Oh, what do you care if that's because it's a tax-free thing, so if you're upper income, well, the government's paying about half the extra cost, so why not just stay with open-ended fee-for-service? Now, I keep thinking at some point this is going to get so expensive that some employers are going to have to wise up. And in fact, over the years, I've written about the idea they could get together one way or another and form exchanges, which would resemble, for example, what we have in California with the California Public Employees Retirement System, CalPERS, which is an expanded version of the University of California, if you like. And they offer a range of choices, and they broker these choices. Well, they're so big, they care for 1.3 million people, so the administrative costs are very small, like 0.5% of premium revenue, because when you're doing it on a large scale, it's not costly. So what I've hoped employers would do is see a way to get together and form exchanges where they could offer their employees these choices.
With this background, both in defense and then in healthcare reform, give us your reflections on the recent debate and the Obama reforms that emerged. Overall, was this moving in the right direction, or was it so half-baked that you don't reach the systemic changes you want?
I think it was a huge disappointment. Obama didn't provide serious guidance of where this ought to go. I could just see the medical industrial complex descending on the White House and on the Congress, and they deployed huge resources, like $1.2 billion spent on lobbying campaigns and so forth. Remember one day the pharmaceutical people came in and made a deal with Obama. We will support health reform for, it will contribute $80 billion over the next 10 years. Well, that's a very small volume to get 30 million more paying customers. That's not even a good volume discount. I mean, that's 1% or so of their expected revenues. So then others came in, and yes, we will support health reform, but it's always on our terms that we will be able to preserve the existing system. And then with the Congress, I think some were just so eager to get more people insured, which is a valuable, worthy goal, that they were willing to overlook the issues of costs. So the medical industrial complex was able to fight off any serious strategy of cost restraint. So in fact, to me, the net bottom line on the Obama plan is that the actuaries at HHS, who are well-regarded independent people, did a projection of healthcare spending after the legislation versus before the legislation, and found it increased spending somewhat. Not hugely, but somewhat. So here, Obama, Orszag, and other people ahead of time were saying, we've got to get the spending under control or it's going to strangle our economy, a judgment with which I completely agree, and then go along with something that is designed by the Congress and the interest groups, which doesn't get spending under control. And I just think that's a huge disappointment. I think it's not sustainable. I think one way or another, the American people are just not going to stand for it. I don't know how it's going to play out, but one way of putting it is we already had 2 or 3 large open-ended entitlements that we couldn't afford before this one came along. So we had Medicare for the aged and disabled, open-ended entitlement, fee-for-service and so on. Then we have Medicaid, similar, although changing more to managed care. And then the tax exclusion of employer contributions from employee taxable income, which has powerful incentive effects, as I explained, and costs well over $200 billion a year. So we've got those going, which have to be reformed, and instead they add a new one, which is government subsidies to low-income people to buy them into the same defective, fundamentally flawed system. Then you're going to say, well, what do I think they should have done? And I do have an answer for that, which is...
Please.
Yes. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, usually considered a liberal Democrat, I think a bright, progressive guy. He studied at Stanford. Can't be all bad. Teamed up with Senator Bob Bennett from Utah, generally considered a conservative Republican, alas, not conservative enough for some of his
Yeah.
old folks. And they created a kind of market-based reform that looks a lot like Consumer Choice Health Plan, my 1978 articles, in which everybody would have a range of choices. If your income was low on a sliding scale, the government would help you, buy you in. Everybody would have to buy health insurance because if they're free to insure or not insure, then what will happen is only the sick will buy insurance, and you get an upward spiral in the costs. And there would be what they called health help agencies to kind of broker the whole thing and oversee it, take you by the hand and put you in front of the computer, whatever it is, and say, here are your choices, look over the information, pick the plan of your choice, and then you pay more if it costs more. And they got 16 senators, 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats, to co-sponsor this. And that was the right general idea. Now, as soon as you put something out there, oh, this or that, people have a lot of little objections. Well, that's something you can manage in the political process, but I felt that's the right idea. I mean, that's the idea that could work, could bring satisfaction to the American people. It's worked well for the universities, for the state of Wisconsin, state of California. Not well enough because there are too many people still out there in open-ended fee-for-service. This system is still dominated by the inflationary incentives.
One final question. If students were to watch this program and see what you tried to do in defense and in healthcare, sort of bringing rationality to public debates on issues that really push a lot of people, what advice would you give them to prepare for carrying forward the mantle?
Well, one thing is, I'm a little hesitant to claim the mantle of rationality, like I'm rational, therefore you're non-rational, therefore you're no good. Is rationality does depend on values and on objectives and goals. And so in the Defense Department, we found we needed to develop what we called it explicit criteria of the national interest that we could state and defend. And interestingly enough, other people, although what they really wanted was the factory in their district, were a little embarrassed to get up and say, no, that's the main thing, because the American people were told, we're going to get you an efficient, effective defense. Well, in healthcare, what I'm proposing is economically rational from the point of view of the consumers who have to pay for it. And it's not rational, from the point of view of the medical device makers who would lose money in the world I'm talking about, or I think it'd be fine for the doctors. They're going to make out one way or another, but there'd probably be less hospitalization. So some interests would not be well served. So going into it, you just need to be aware of that and to be willing to think through what are the values and interests that I'm willing to believe in and willing to defend, and then kind of work back from those.
Well, on that note, and I think it's a hopeful note, because despite the difficulties in these policy processes, I think we move forward. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come to the campus and be on our program.
Well, it was a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And I want to thank our audience also and make note that this is the 500th interview in our series, which started in 1982. And I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers for watching us on YouTube and on satellite television. Thank you very much.